Number 1, Buddy Holly. In the history of rock and roll, there are tragedies. And then there is the singular, cataclysmic event that didn't just kill a star, but nearly extinguished the genre itself before it had even fully begun. This is the story of February 3, 1959, a date so scarred into the American consciousness that it is simply known as the day the music died. It wasn't just a plane crash. It was the annihilation of the future. On board a tiny, single-engine aircraft fighting through a blinding Iowa snowstorm were three of the biggest stars on the planet. Buddy Holly, the bespectacled genius who wrote the blueprint for the modern rock band. Ritchie Valens, the 17-year-old prodigy who was the first Latino rock superstar. And the Big Bopper, the larger-than-life radio personality who had charmed the nation. They were young, they were untouchable, and they were fleeing a tour bus from hell, only to run straight into an icy grave in a cornfield. We are investigating the 10 most heartbreaking air disasters that silenced the music industry forever. If you believe that the legends we lost in the sky deserve to be remembered and their stories told with the respect they earned, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators. And if you appreciate this deep dive into the history of music's darkest days, hit the like button to support the channel. To understand why they were on that plane, you have to understand the Winter Dance Party Tour. It was a disaster from the start. A grueling, poorly planned trek through the frozen Midwest in the dead of winter. The tour buses were broken, freezing metal tubes with no heat. It was so cold that the drummer Carl Bunch developed frostbite on his feet and had to be hospitalized. Buddy Holly, the leader of the tour, and the man who had just rewritten the rules of music with hits like Peggy Sue, was fed up. He was tired of freezing, tired of dirty clothes, and tired of the misery. When the tour arrived at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa on February 2nd, Buddy made a decision that would change history. He chartered a small plane, a Beechcraft Bonanza, to fly him and his bandmates to the next stop in Moorhead, Minnesota. He wanted to get there early, do his laundry, and sleep in a warm bed. It was a decision born of simple human exhaustion. But the plane only had 3 passenger seats. What followed was a series of fateful, almost supernatural swaps and coin tosses that determined who would live and who would die. The lineup for the flight was supposed to be Buddy Holly and his bandmates, Waylon Jennings and Tommy Allsup. But fate intervened. The Big Bopper, J.P. Richardson, was sick with the flu. He approached Waylon Jennings and asked for his seat so he could get some rest. Waylon, a future country legend, graciously gave it up. When Buddy Holly heard this, he jokingly told Waylon, "Well, I hope your old bus freezes up." Waylon famously replied with a line that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Well, I hope you're all playing crashes." It was a dark joke between friends, never meant to be a prophecy. Meanwhile, 17-year-old Ritchie Valens, who had never flown on a small plane before and had a fear of flying, due to a childhood trauma where a plane crashed into his schoolyard, asked Tommy Allsup for his seat. Allsup wasn't sure. They decided to flip a coin. In a crowded ballroom dressing room, a coin was tossed in the air. Ritchie called heads. It was heads. He won the seat. He reportedly said, "That's the first time I've ever won anything in my life." He didn't know he had just won a ticket to his own death. This moment forces us to confront the terrifying randomness of fate. A coin toss decided the future of music history. Do you believe in destiny, or was this just a horrific series of coincidences? I want to hear your thoughts on the nature of fate in the comments below. The plane took off shortly after 1 a.m. into a pitch-black sky and a worsening blizzard. The pilot, Roger Peterson, was young and inexperienced with flying by instruments alone. He was flying into a black hole, unable to see the horizon, disoriented by the swirling snow. Minutes after takeoff, the plane disappeared from sight. There was no radio call, no distress signal. It simply vanished into the white void. The next morning, the wreckage was found in a cornfield less than 6 miles from the airport. The plane had slammed into the frozen ground at full speed, cartwheeling across the field. All 4 men on board, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, the Big Bopper, and the pilot, were killed instantly. The scene was devastating. The contents of their pockets, the dice, the guitar picks, were scattered in the snow, frozen artifacts of a joyride gone wrong. Buddy Holly was 22. The Big Bopper was 28. Ritchie Valens was just 17 years old. The aftermath was a global wake. It felt as though the youth movement itself had been decapitated. But the tragedy had a ripple effect that touched everyone. Buddy Holly's pregnant wife, Maria Elena, learned of his death by watching the news on television. The shock caused her to suffer a miscarriage the next day, losing the only child Buddy Holly would ever have. This horrific oversight led to policies that names of victims are not released until families are notified. The crash ended the age of innocence. It was the moment the 50s truly ended and the darkness of the 60s began. Don McLean would later immortalize the tragedy in American Pie, cementing the idea that the music, the pure, unadulterated joy of rock and roll, died in that cornfield. The investigation revealed that the pilot was not qualified to fly in such conditions, a senseless error that cost the world 3 of its brightest lights. They were pioneers who were just getting started, wiped out because of a broken heater on a bus and a coin toss in a dressing room. This case remains the ultimate what-if of music history. Had that coin landed on tails, had the bus heater not broken, what would Ritchie Valens have become? Would Buddy Holly have been bigger than the Beatles? I want to hear your theories on the lost future of rock and roll in the comments below.
Number 2. Aaliyah. We move from the frozen cornfields of Iowa to the turquoise waters of the Bahamas, shifting our focus from the birth of rock and roll to the golden age of R&B, to uncover a tragedy that felt less like an accident and more like a stolen future. This is the heartbreaking story of Aaliyah Houghton, the princess of R&B, a woman who, at just 22 years old, was on the verge of conquering not just the music world, but Hollywood as well. She was the it girl of the new millennium, a trendsetter with a voice like silk and a mysterious, cool demeanor that captivated millions. She had just released her self-titled third album, a masterpiece of futuristic soul, and had filmed a role in The Matrix Reloaded. She was poised to become the biggest star on the planet, a peer to Beyoncé and Britney Spears. But on August 25, 2001, that trajectory was violently cut short on a runway in the Abaco Islands, a disaster born of impatience, negligence, and a pilot who should never have been in the cockpit. To understand the crash, you have to look at the context of the trip. Aaliyah and her team had flown to the Bahamas to film the music video for Rock the Boat. The shoot was a success, capturing the stunning beauty of the island and the artist. They finished filming a day early. Aaliyah, eager to get back to Miami to be with her boyfriend, Damon Dash, decided not to wait for the larger plane scheduled for the next day. Her team chartered a smaller aircraft, a twin-engine Cessna 402B, to take them home immediately. It was a decision driven by the understandable desire to go home, but it was a decision that walked them into a death trap. The scene at the Marsh Harbor Airport was chaotic. The Cessna was significantly smaller than the plane they had arrived in. Aaliyah, her entourage of 7 hair and makeup stylists, bodyguards, and record label executives, plus all of the heavy equipment and luggage from the shoot, were simply too much for the small aircraft. Witnesses and airport baggage handlers later reported a heated argument on the tarmac. The pilot, Luis Morales III, reportedly argued that the plane was overloaded, that there was too much weight. But the pressure to leave, the pressure of the celebrity schedule, prevailed. The bags were loaded, the passengers boarded. The plane was estimated to be overloaded by 700 pounds, and crucially, the center of gravity was pushed far too far to the back, making the aircraft unstable. This moment raises a furious question about the power dynamics between celebrities and service providers. Do you think the pilot was pressured into flying against his better judgment because of who his passengers were, or was he simply negligent? Can a pilot ever truly say no to a superstar entourage? I want to hear your perspective on this fatal decision in the comments. The plane taxied out. It accelerated down the runway. It lifted off the ground, but it never truly flew. Just 200 feet from the end of the runway, the instability caused by the excess weight took over. The nose pitched up, the plane stalled, and it banked sharply to the left. It slammed into the swampy ground just moments after takeoff, exploding on impact. The crash was catastrophic. Aaliyah and 8 others were killed. Some died instantly, others, including Aaliyah, reportedly died moments later from severe burns and head trauma. But the true horror of the crash wasn't revealed until the investigation began. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and Bahamian authorities uncovered a litany of failures that turned this tragedy into a crime. The pilot, Luis Morales III, was not certified to fly that specific plane. Even worse, he had falsified his FAA records to get the job. And the darkest revelation of all? Toxicology reports found traces of cocaine and alcohol in his system. He was an unqualified pilot, flying an overloaded plane under the influence of drugs. He had been hired just 2 days before the crash by a charter company that didn't even have a permit to operate in the Bahamas. Aaliyah had been placed in the hands of a system that failed her at every single level. She was the victim of a Wild West charter industry that cut corners to make a profit. The revelation about the pilot's drug use changes the entire narrative from an accident to something approaching manslaughter. Do you believe the charter company should have faced criminal charges for hiring him, or is the blame solely on the pilot? Let me know who you hold responsible for the death of the Princess of R&B. The aftermath was a global outpouring of grief. Rock the Boat became a posthumous anthem, the video serving as a haunting final goodbye. The music industry was forced to reckon with its own demanding culture, but for Aaliyah's family and fans, the lesson came too late. She was a generational talent who was wiped out because of a few extra suitcases and a pilot who wasn't fit to fly. She remains frozen in time at 22, the girl who was 1 in a million, lost to the careless negligence of a single afternoon. If this tragic story of a superstar betrayed by incompetence moved you, please hit the like button. Share this video with every R&B fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 3, where we will investigate the plane crash that decimated the greatest Southern rock band in history.
Number 3. Lynyrd Skynyrd. We move from the solo tragedies of pop stars to the collective nightmare of a band that defined a genre. A group of long-haired whiskey-drinking rebels who took the blues of the South and turned it into the hard-driving anthems of a nation. This is the story of Lynyrd Skynyrd, the undisputed kings of Southern rock. By October 1977, they were on top of the world. They had survived the bar fights, the drug arrests, and the grueling tour schedules to become one of the biggest acts in America. Their hit Freebird was the national anthem of rock and roll, and their new album, Street Survivors, had just been released 3 days earlier, featuring a cover art that would soon become a chilling, prophetic image, the band standing engulfed in flames. But the fire that would destroy Lynyrd Skynyrd wasn't on an album cover. It was in the engines of a decrepit leased aircraft that had no business being in the sky. This is the devastating account of a plane crash that didn't just kill a few members, it decapitated the band, taking the voice, the soul, and the future of Southern rock in a single violent impact in a Mississippi swamp. To understand the crash, you have to understand the plane. It was a 1948 Convair CB-240, a relic from another era. It was slow, cramped, and prone to mechanical issues. In fact, earlier that same year, the band Aerosmith had looked at leasing the exact same plane, but had rejected it. Their manager reportedly saw the pilots passing a bottle of Jack Daniels back and forth in the cockpit and decided the plane and its crew were a death trap. Lynyrd Skynyrd, however, didn't have that luxury, or perhaps that foresight. They were on a tight schedule, flying from Greenville, South Carolina to Baton Rouge, Louisiana for a show at LSU. The band members were terrified of the plane. They had nicknamed it Freebird in a dark joke.
Cassie Gaines, the backup singer, was so afraid of the aircraft that she had offered to ride in the equipment truck instead. But she was convinced by the others to board for what was supposed to be a short, routine flight. It was a decision that cost her life. On the afternoon of October 20th, 1977, the plane took off. For the first part of the journey, everything seemed normal. The band was playing poker, relaxing, and celebrating their new album. But as they crossed into Mississippi airspace, the pilots, Walter McCreary and William Gray, realized they had made a catastrophic error. They weren't just having engine trouble, they were running out of gas. Due to a mechanical fault in the right engine's magneto and a likely error in fuel management, the plane was burning fuel far faster than calculated. At 6,000 feet, the right engine sputtered and died. The pilots feathered the prop and tried to limp to the nearest airport in Macomb, Mississippi. But then the silence became absolute. The left engine starved of fuel and stopped. The Convair 240 was no longer a plane. It was a 40,000-pound glider made of metal, falling out of the sky over a dense, dark swamp. The realization in the cabin was instantaneous and terrifying. Artemis Pyle, the drummer, later recalled the pilots turning around with terror in their eyes. Ronnie Van Zant, the lead singer, and the father of the band, who had famously told people he would never live to see 30, was reportedly asleep or lying on the floor to rest his back. He was woken up to the end of his life. He calmly grabbed a red velvet pillow and shook the hand of Gary Rossington. There was no screaming. There was just a quiet acceptance of the fate he had always predicted. The plane clipped the tops of the trees near Gillsburg, Mississippi. The sound was deafening as the wings were sheared off, the fuselage tearing apart like a tin can. The plane slammed into the ground, skidding through the mud and the trees before coming to a violent halt. The impact was devastating. Ronnie Van Zant, the man with the voice of the South, was thrown from the plane and died instantly of head injuries. He was 29 years old, fulfilling his own dark prophecy. Steve Gaines, the incredible guitarist who was revitalizing the band, and his sister Cassie Gaines, who didn't want to get on the plane, were also killed on impact, along with the band's road manager Dean Kilpatrick and both the pilots. The survivors were left in a scene from hell. The swamp was dark, silent, and filled with the smell of jet fuel and the cries of the injured. Artemis Pyle, with broken ribs and serious injuries, managed to crawl out of the wreckage. He stumbled through the swamp, bleeding and desperate, until he found a farmhouse to get help. The legend goes that the farmer, terrified by the bloodied, long-haired man emerging from the woods, shot him in the shoulder, although the farmer later denied this, claiming he fired a warning shot. Regardless, help was summoned. But for the heart of the band, it was too late. The crash of Lynyrd Skynyrd is the most significant air disaster in rock history because of what it took away. It didn't just kill musicians. It killed a family. It ended the trajectory of a band that was evolving into something even greater. The Street Survivors album cover was immediately recalled and changed to a black background out of respect, but the original image of the band in flames remains a haunting artifact of the tragedy. This case is surrounded by an aura of doom and premonition. Ronnie Van Zant's prediction of his own death before 30 is legendary. Do you believe that some people have a sense of their own destiny, or is this just us looking for meaning in a random mechanical failure? Was the crash avoidable negligence by the pilots, or a tragic twist of fate? I want to hear your thoughts on the Skynyrd curse in the comments below. The survivors eventually reunited a decade later, but the magic of the original lineup was buried in that Mississippi swamp. They were free birds who were grounded by gravity and human error, leaving behind a legacy that is equal parts triumph and tragedy. If this heartbreaking story of the day Southern rock died left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with every classic rock fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 4, where we will investigate the tragedy of the King of Soul, who crashed into an icy lake just days after recording his biggest hit.
Number 4. Otis Redding. We leave the swamps of Mississippi and travel north to the freezing gray waters of Lake Monona in Madison, Wisconsin, to witness the extinguishing of a fire that was warming the soul of the entire world. This is the heartbreaking story of the King of Soul, Otis Redding, a man whose voice was a force of nature, capable of expressing a depth of emotion that transcended race, genre, and geography. By December 1967, Otis was not just a singer, he was a titan, a 26-year-old phenomenon who had just conquered the white rock audience at the Monterey Pop Festival, bridging the racial divide of the 1960s with nothing but charisma and a microphone. He was on the verge of a new era, having just spent weeks in a houseboat in Sausalito, California, writing and recording a song that was a radical departure from his gritty R&B roots, a folk-tinged ballad called "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay." He told his wife, Zelma, that this was the song that would make him #1, the track that would change everything. He was right, but in a cruel twist of destiny that feels written by a tragedian, he would never live to hear the final mix, and he would never see the song climb the charts. He died just 3 days after recording his masterpiece, plunging into the ice-cold water, while the whistle at the end of the track, a placeholder he intended to replace with lyrics, became the haunting final echo of his life. The tragedy of Otis Redding is compounded by the loss of the future. He wasn't just a star who burned out. He was an artist who was just figuring out how bright he could shine. The flight that ended the golden age of soul began on December 10, 1967. Otis and his backing band, the Bar-Kays, a group of incredibly talented teenagers, some as young as 17, were traveling from Cleveland, Ohio to Madison, Wisconsin for a concert at the Factory nightclub. They were flying in Otis's own plane, a Beechcraft H-18, a twin-engine aircraft that was a symbol of his success. The weather across the Midwest was atrocious, a soup of fog, rain, and drizzle that grounded many commercial flights. The pilot, Richard Frazier, was experienced, but the conditions were deteriorating rapidly as they approached Madison. Otis, sitting in the co-pilot seat, was reported in good spirits, happy to be heading to the next gig, living the life of a touring musician. But 4 miles from the runway, the world turned upside down. The plane didn't send a distress signal. There was no radio chatter indicating a problem. It simply dropped out of the low clouds and slammed into the surface of Lake Monona. The water was freezing, hovering just above 32 degrees. The impact tore the fuselage open, and the plane sank almost immediately into the murky depths. Of the 8 people on board, only one man would survive to tell the tale, and his story is one of the most harrowing survival accounts in music history. Ben Cowley, the trumpet player for the Bar-Kays, was asleep in the back. He woke up to the sensation of falling, followed by the terrifying crash of metal hitting water. He was thrown into the freezing darkness. He couldn't swim. He described clutching a seat cushion, kicking his legs, gasping for air as the water filled his lungs. He heard the screams of his bandmates, his friends, the boys he had grown up with. And then he heard silence. He was alone in the freezing lake, clinging to a piece of foam, surrounded by debris and the bodies of his friends. He waited in the water for 20 minutes, hypothermia setting in, until a rescue boat finally pulled him out. He kept asking, "Where is Otis? Where is Otis?" The rescuers didn't have the heart to tell him what they were finding. The next day, the grim task of recovering the plane began. Divers pulled the wreckage from the lake bottom. The image of Otis Redding, the man who sang with such fire, being pulled from the icy water, still strapped into his seat, was a visual punch to the gut of America. He had died on impact or drowned moments later. The Bar-Kays were decimated. Jimmy King, Ronnie Coldwin, Phelan Jones, and Carl Cunningham all perished. They were kids, just starting their lives, wiped out alongside their mentor. The aftermath was a funeral fit for a king. Thousands mourned in Macon, Georgia. But the true legacy of the crash played out on the radio. Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay was released in January 1968. It shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming the first posthumous #1 single in U.S. history. It was a song about resting, about watching the tide roll away while the singer was gone forever. The song's melancholy, breezy vibe took on a devastating new meaning. The whistling solo at the end, which Otis had improvised because he hadn't written the final verse yet, remained on the track, a ghostly reminder of unfinished business. This case is the definition of unfinished genius. Otis was moving toward a new sound, influenced by the Beatles and Bob Dylan. Do you believe that if he had lived, Otis Redding would have reshaped the 70s music landscape? Or was Dock of the Bay a singular lucky lightning strike? I want to hear your thoughts on the lost potential of the King of Soul in the comments below. Otis Redding's death left a void in soul music that was never filled. He was the bridge between the gritty past and the polished future, and that bridge collapsed into Lake Monona on a foggy December afternoon. If this tragic story of the King of Soul, silenced on the verge of his greatest triumph, left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video with every music fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 5, where we will investigate the helicopter crash that killed the greatest blues guitarist of the modern era just moments after he walked off stage.
Number 5. Stevie Ray Vaughan. We leave the freezing lakes of the Midwest and fast forward to the humid, fog-drenched hills of Wisconsin in the summer of 1990 to witness the extinguishing of a flame that had just begun to burn clean. This is the story of Stevie Ray Vaughan, the man in the flat-brimmed hat and the kimono, who didn't just play the blues, he resurrected it, grabbing the genre by the throat and dragging it kicking and screaming into the modern era with a Stratocaster named Number 1. By August 1990, Stevie Ray Vaughan was not just a guitar god, he was a walking miracle. He had spent the 80s playing with a ferocity fueled by cocaine and whiskey, a lifestyle that nearly killed him in 1986 when he collapsed in London. But he had done the impossible. He had gotten sober. He had rebuilt his body and his mind, and he was playing with a clarity and a power that terrified his peers. He was 35 years old. He was in love. He was clean, and he was arguably the greatest guitar player walking the earth. But the tragedy of Stevie Ray Vaughan is that he conquered the demons inside him, only to be taken out by the elements outside him. This is the devastating account of a helicopter ride into oblivion, a crash that happened just minutes after the greatest jam session in blues history, proving that redemption offers no protection against gravity and fog. To understand the magnitude of the loss, you have to look at the night of August 26, 1990. It was a gathering of giants at the Alpine Valley Music Theater in East Troy, Wisconsin. The lineup was a dream. Eric Clapton, Buddy Guy, Robert Cray, and Stevie Ray Vaughan. The show ended with an encore of Sweet Home Chicago, a moment of pure musical ecstasy where the legends stood shoulder to shoulder trading licks. It was the mountaintop. Stevie was beaming. He told his bandmates he had never played better. He walked off stage, sweat-drenched and triumphant, ready to head back to Chicago to sleep. But the logistics of getting out of Alpine Valley were complicated. The venue is isolated, nestled in a valley that is prone to dense, blinding fog. There were 4 helicopters waiting to ferry the stars and their crews back to the city. The plan was loose. Seats were available, but they weren't assigned. Stevie, eager to get back to Chicago to call his girlfriend, Jana Lapidus, asked if he could take a seat on an earlier flight. He approached Peter Jackson, Eric Clapton's tour manager. There were 3 seats open on a Bell 206B Jet Ranger, helicopter reserved for Clapton's entourage. Stevie took one. He boarded the chopper along with Bobby Brooks, Clapton's agent, Nigel Brown, his bodyguard, and Colin Smythe, an assistant tour manager. Eric Clapton and Stevie's brother Jimmy Vaughan were in the other helicopters. It was a decision made in seconds, a simple desire to get home a little faster. The pilot, Jeff Brown, was experienced, but he was not qualified to fly by instruments alone, a crucial skill when flying at night in difficult terrain. The fog was rolling in thick and heavy, obscuring the horizon and the landmarks. At around 12:50 a.m., the helicopter lifted off. It rose about 850 feet into the air. It turned slightly to the left, and then it vanished. It didn't explode in the air. It didn't send a distress call. It simply disappeared into the mist. The other helicopters took off and made it safely to Chicago, unaware that one of their flock had fallen. It wasn't until the next morning, when the helicopter failed to arrive at Meigs Field in Chicago, that the alarm was raised. A search was launched at first light. The wreckage was found not miles away, but just 3/4 of a mile from the takeoff point. The pilot had made a fatal error. Disoriented by the fog and perhaps misjudging the height of the terrain, he had flown the helicopter directly into the side of a man-made ski hill. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft slammed into the slope near the summit at a high speed. Everyone on board was killed instantly. There was no fire, just the twisted metal of the chopper scattered across the grassy slope. When the news broke, it felt like a physical blow to the music world. Stevie Ray Vaughan, the man who had survived addiction, the man who was playing with the fire of Hendrix and the soul of Albert King, was gone. He was identified by his jewelry. Eric Clapton, who was waiting in the hotel in Chicago, was devastated, realizing that the seat Stevie took was a seat on a flight that carried his own crew. The randomness of the tragedy was suffocating. If Stevie had stayed to sign one more autograph, if he had waited for the next chopper, if the fog had cleared for 5 minutes, the history of the blues would be different. This case haunts music fans because Stevie was in his redemption arc. He was supposed to have decades of music ahead of him. Do you believe that Stevie Ray Vaughan had already peaked, or were we robbed of an even greater evolution of his sound? Would he have become the biggest rock star of the 90s if he had lived? I want to hear your thoughts on his lost potential in the comments below. Stevie Ray Vaughan's death left a silence in the blues that has never been filled. He proved that you can beat the devil in the bottle, but you cannot beat the mountain in the fog. He left the stage at the absolute height of his powers, a guitar hero who ascended into the clouds and never came back down. If this heartbreaking story of the Texas floods silenced by the fog left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video with every guitar player you know, and make sure you are subscribed for part 6, where we will investigate the horrifying prank that killed a heavy metal legend in a plane crash that defied all logic.
Number 6. Randy Rhoads. We move from the uncontrollable forces of nature, the fog, the ice, the storms, to the infuriating, preventable realm of human stupidity and recklessness. This is the story of a crash that wasn't caused by a mechanical failure, but by a prank gone horribly, fatally wrong. This is the tragedy of Randall William Rhoads, the blonde-haired angel of heavy metal who saved Ozzy Osbourne's life only to lose his own in a joyride he didn't even want to take. In 1982, Randy Rhoads was not just a guitarist, he was a revolutionary. He was a classically trained musician who brought the complexity of Mozart and the speed of a fighter jet to the world of rock. He had taken Ozzy, a man who had been fired from Black Sabbath and left for dead by the industry, and resurrected his career with riffs like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley. Randy was the quiet one, a dedicated student of his instrument who drank tea while the rest of the band drank vodka, a young man who planned to quit rock and roll to get a master's degree in classical guitar. He was the future of the instrument, a virtuoso who played with a precision that terrified his peers. But on a sunny morning in Florida, his future was stolen by a tour bus driver who decided to play chicken with a Beechcraft Bonanza, turning a moment of boredom into a massacre that left the Prince of Darkness sobbing in a driveway. The setting for this nightmare was the Flying Baron Estates in Leesburg, Florida. It was March 19, 1982. The Ozzy Osbourne tour bus had stopped at the estate, which belonged to the tour bus company, to fix a malfunctioning air conditioning unit. The band was asleep on the bus, exhausted from the road. The driver, Andrew Aycock, was a man with a troubled history and a cocaine habit who had reportedly been awake all night. Without permission, Aycock took a Beechcraft F-35 plane from the hangar. He was a licensed pilot, but his medical certificate had expired. He took the keyboardist, Don Irie, up for a joyride first, buzzing the bus in a display of reckless bravado. He landed safely, but the adrenaline wasn't enough. He wanted to go up again. He invited Randy Rhoads and the band's seamstress and makeup artist, Rachel Youngblood. Randy was afraid of flying. He hated it. But he agreed to go up for one simple, heartbreaking reason. He wanted to take aerial photos of the countryside to send to his mother in California. He wasn't looking for a thrill, he was looking for a postcard. He boarded the plane with his camera. Rachel Youngblood, a 58-year-old woman who was the mother figure of the tour, boarded with him. They were innocent passengers in the hands of a madman. The flight quickly turned from a scenic tour into a game of Russian roulette. Aycock, allegedly fueled by cocaine residue found later in his system and a recent divorce that had left him unstable, began to buzz the tour bus, where Ozzy Osbourne and his wife Sharon were sleeping. He flew low, terrifyingly low. He made 2 passes, the engine roaring just feet above the roof of the bus. It was a prank, a way to wake up the rock stars. But on the 3rd pass, the geometry of the stunt failed. Aycock misjudged the altitude or the angle. The left wing of the plane clipped the top of the tour bus. The impact was violent and immediate. It shredded the fiberglass roof of the bus, sending the plane spiraling out of control. The aircraft didn't just crash, it cartwheeled over the bus, severed the top of a pine tree, and then slammed directly into the garage of the mansion nearby. The plane exploded on impact. The fireball was massive, consuming the garage and the aircraft in seconds. Inside the bus, Ozzy Osbourne was thrown from his bunk. He thought they had hit a car. He ran out into the smoke and the chaos, shouting for Randy. He found the mansion in flames. He tried to get close to see if anyone could be saved, but the heat was too intense. Inside the Inferno, Randy Rhoads, Rachel Youngblood, and Andrew Aycock were killed instantly. The crash was so violent that the bodies were burned beyond recognition. Randy Rhoads had to be identified by his dental records and his jewelry. The investigation later revealed a chilling detail about the pilot's past. Andrew Aycock had survived a previous plane crash in the United Arab Emirates 6 years earlier, a crash that had killed his passenger. He had walked away from death once, only to invite it back in for a rematch, taking 2 innocent souls with him. The toxicology report confirmed cocaine in Aycock's urine, painting a picture of a drug-fueled decision that wiped out a genius. This case is infuriating because it was not an accident in the traditional sense. It was an act of criminal negligence. Do you believe that the tour bus company should have been held criminally liable for employing Aycock, or is the pilot the only one to blame? Was this manslaughter or just a tragedy of the rock and roll lifestyle? I want to hear your verdict on this senseless loss in the comments below. Randy Rhoads died at 25 years old. He released only 2 major albums with Ozzy, yet he is consistently ranked as one of the greatest guitarists of all time. His death sent Ozzy into a spiral of depression and drug use that nearly killed him. The tragedy of Randy Rhoads is that he wasn't a casualty of his own excess. He was the sober one, the responsible one, killed by the very chaos he tried to avoid. He went up to take a picture of the world and never came back down, leaving a silence in the world of heavy metal that has never been filled. If this heartbreaking story of a guitar god killed by a reckless prank left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video with every metal fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 7, where we will investigate the country music queen who flew into a storm because she just wanted to get home to her children. Number 7. Patsy Cline. We leave the burning wreckage of the 1980s and travel back to the golden age of Nashville in the early 1960s to witness the silencing of the most important female voice in the history of country music. This is the heartbreaking story of Virginia Patterson Hensley, known to eternity as Patsy Cline. She was not just a singer, she was a force of nature. A woman who broke the cowgirl mold and forced country music into the pop charts with a voice that was equal parts velvet and steel. With hits like Walkin' After Midnight, I Fall to Pieces, and the Willie Nelson-penned masterpiece, Crazy, the most played song on jukeboxes in history, she became the first female solo artist to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. But Patsy Cline was also a woman haunted by a premonition of her own end. She had survived a horrific car accident in 1961 that threw her through a windshield and left her scarred and broken, a near-death experience that changed her fundamental view of mortality. She famously told friends, "I had 2 bad ones. The third one will either be a charm or it'll kill me." She began giving away her possessions, writing wills on napkins, and telling her peers that she wouldn't live to see old age. It was a fatalism that surrounded her like a shroud, and on a stormy March evening in 1963, that dark prophecy fulfilled itself in a dense forest in Tennessee, proving that sometimes the urgency to get home to the ones you love can drive you straight into the arms of death. The chain of events leading to the crash began with an act of charity. Patsy had flown to Kansas City to perform at a benefit concert for the family of Cactus Jack Call, a disc jockey who had died. She was sick with the flu, tired, and eager to return to her 2 young children in Nashville. The weather was apocalyptic. A massive storm front was moving across the Midwest, bringing low clouds, heavy rain, and gusting winds. It was weather that grounded commercial airliners, let alone the small, single-engine Piper Comanche that Patsy was traveling in. Her pilot was not a professional aviator, he was her manager, Randy Hughes. Hughes was a dedicated man, but he was not instrument-rated. This meant he was only qualified to fly when he could physically see the ground. Flying into a storm, into clouds where visibility is 0, requires a specific set of skills to trust the gauges over your own senses. Hughes didn't have those skills. He was flying blind into a trap. Fellow country star Dottie West, seeing the weather reports, begged Patsy to drive back with her. She implored her, "Don't get in that plane." But Patsy, driven by a fierce, stubborn desire to be with her kids, refused. She famously told Dottie, "Don't worry about me, Hoss. When it's my time to go, it's my time." It was a statement of cowboy philosophy that would become her epitaph. The plane took off, stopping in Dyersburg, Tennessee to refuel. The airfield manager there warned them. He told Hughes the weather ahead was a solid wall of rain and fog. He offered them a car. He offered them beds for the night. Hughes refused. He said he would follow the highway back to Nashville, using the headlights of the cars below as his guide. It was a desperate, reckless plan. They took off into the dark, turbulent sky at 6:07 p.m. They were only 90 miles from home. But just minutes later, the trap sprung. The plane entered severe turbulence and clouds. Without visual reference points, Randy Hughes likely suffered from spatial disorientation, a terrifying phenomenon where the pilot's inner ear lies to them. He couldn't tell up from down. He likely believed he was flying straight while he was actually in a graveyard spiral, a steep, diving turn that accelerates the aircraft toward the ground. Witnesses on the ground heard the engine screaming, the sound of a plane in a full-throttle dive, fighting a battle it had already lost. The Piper Comanche slammed into a wooded ridge near Camden, Tennessee at nearly 200 miles per hour.
The impact was absolute. The plane didn't just crash, it disintegrated. Patsy Cline, along with Cowboy Copas, Hawkshaw Hawkins, and Randy Hughes, died instantly. The destruction was so complete that when the first responders and friends, including country legend Roger Miller, arrived at the scene the next morning, they couldn't find the plane. They found what Miller described as confetti. The aircraft had been shredded into pieces no larger than a table. Clothes, musical instruments, and personal items were hanging from the trees, a gruesome decoration in the quiet forest. Miller recalled finding Patsy's lighter and then her watch. It had stopped at exactly 6:20 p.m. The Queen of Country was gone. She was 30 years old. The voice that could make a grown man cry was silenced by a storm and a decision to push through the danger. This case is a haunting study of intuition and risk. Patsy felt her time was coming, yet she kept moving toward it. Do you believe that her premonitions were real, or was it simply a case of a risk-taker finally running out of luck? Was her refusal to drive a sign of bravery or fatal impatience? I want to hear your thoughts on the psychology of her final decision in the comments below. Patsy Cline's death devastated Nashville. It was the first time a female superstar had been taken at the height of her powers. Her music experienced a massive resurgence, becoming timeless standards that transcend the genre. But the crash serves as a permanent, somber warning in the aviation world about the dangers of get-there-ness, the psychological drive to complete a flight despite unsafe conditions. Patsy Cline proved that you can be the toughest woman in the room, you can survive a car crash that breaks your body, but you cannot survive gravity when the sky turns against you. If this heartbreaking story of the voice that defined heartbreak left you stunned, please hit the like button, share this video with every country music fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 8, where we will investigate the time-in-a-bottle singer who crashed into a tree just as his career was taking flight. Number 8. Jim Croce. We move from the storms of Tennessee to the humid, pine-scented darkness of Louisiana in 1973 to uncover a tragedy that is arguably the most poignant and ironic in music history. This is the story of Jim Croce, the working-class poet of the 1970s, a man with a mustache and a cigar who looked like a truck driver, but wrote songs with the delicate soul of a master craftsman. He gave the world characters like Bad, Bad Leroy Brown, but he also gave us Time in a Bottle, a song so achingly beautiful and terrified of the passage of time that it feels like a premonition written in melody. Jim Croce was not an overnight sensation. He was a grinder. He had spent years driving trucks, working construction, and playing in dive bars, struggling to support his wife, Ingrid, and their infant son, AJ. By September 1973, he had finally made it. He was a superstar with #1 hits and sold-out shows. But the fame he had chased for so long had turned into a cage. He was exhausted, he missed his family, and on the very night he died, he had come to a life-altering decision. He was going to quit. He had written a letter to his wife, a letter that wouldn't arrive until after he was dead, telling her that he was done with the road, done with the music business, and coming home to be a husband and a father. He was a man who had finally realized that time was the only currency that mattered, only to have his own clock smashed just hours later. This is the devastating account of a plane crash that happened not in a storm, not due to a mechanical failure, but because of a single solitary tree standing in the dark, proving that sometimes you can be mere inches away from freedom and still not make it. The final chapter of Jim Croce's life took place on September 20th, 1973 in Natchitoches, Louisiana. He had just finished a concert at Northwestern State University. The crowd loved him. He was charming, funny, and brilliant. After the show, he and his musical partner, Maury Muhlenheisen, a quiet genius whose guitar work defined the Croce sound, boarded a chartered Beechcraft E-18S. They were heading to Sherman, Texas for the next gig, a short hop that would bring Jim one step closer to the end of the tour and his new life.
The pilot was Robert Elliott, a man with thousands of hours of flight time. The weather was clear, visibility was good. There was no reason for disaster. It was a perfect night for flying. The plane taxied to the end of the runway. At 10:45 p.m., the engines roared and the aircraft began its roll. It gathered speed, lifting off the tarmac, rising into the black Louisiana sky. But it didn't rise fast enough. Just past the end of the runway, standing like a sentinel in the darkness, was a massive pecan tree. It was the only obstacle for miles. The pilot, for reasons that remain a subject of debate, some say he suffered a heart attack, others say he became disoriented by the darkness and the black hole effect of taking off over unlit terrain, failed to pull up in time. The plane clipped the top of the pecan tree. It wasn't a glancing blow, it was a violent collision that shredded the aircraft. The plane cartwheeled through the air and slammed into the ground, collapsing into a heap of twisted metal. There was no fire, just the sickening crunch of impact, and then silence. Jim Croce, Maury Muehleisen, the comedian George Stevens, the road manager, and the pilot were all killed instantly. He was 30 years old. He died just minutes after singing I Got a Name, a song about moving forward, about living life to the fullest. The investigation by the NTSB blamed pilot error, citing the failure to see and avoid obstructions, but also noted that the pilot had severe coronary artery disease, suggesting a possible medical emergency at the controls. But for the fans, the cause didn't matter. The loss was absolute. The letter Jim wrote to his wife arrived days after his funeral, a voice from the grave promising a future that would never happen. But the most haunting legacy of the crash was the song Time in a Bottle. It had been an album track, a love song written for his unborn son. After his death, the lyrics, "If I could save time in a bottle, the first thing that I'd like to do is to save every day till eternity passes away," took on a crushing new weight. The song shot to #1. It became the anthem of grief for a generation, a reminder that we all think we have enough time until we don't. This case is uniquely tragic because of the letter. He had already mentally left the industry. Do you believe that Jim Croce had a sense of his own mortality that drove him to write such urgent songs about time? Or is it just a heartbreaking coincidence that his most famous lyrics became his eulogy? I want to hear your thoughts on the poetry of his death in the comments below. Jim Croce's death robbed the world of a storyteller who was just hitting his stride. He was the voice of the common man, a guy who could make you laugh with Leroy Brown and cry with Operator. He proved that you can work your whole life to catch the bus, but you never know if the bus is going to take you home or take you off a cliff. He remains frozen in 1973, the man with the mustache and the guitar who tried to save time but ran out of it in a Louisiana pecan grove. This tear-jerking story of the working-class hero who died trying to get home left you stunned? Please hit the like button, share this video with every folk music fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 9, where we will head to the California coast to investigate the experimental plane crash that killed the singer who begged us to take me home country roads.
Number 9. John Denver. We leave the pecan groves of Louisiana and fly west to the sparkling, rugged coastline of Monterey Bay, California, to investigate the death of a man who was the human embodiment of the American outdoors. This is the story of Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., known to the world as John Denver. He was the wholesome, bespectacled troubadour who gave us Rocky Mountain High, Sunshine on My Shoulders, and the eternal anthem, Take Me Home, Country Roads. He was the biggest-selling artist of 1974, a man who sold millions of records by singing about nature, peace, and the simple joy of being alive. But John Denver had another passion that rivaled his love for music: aviation. He was a highly experienced pilot with over 2,700 hours of flight time, a man who felt closer to God in the cockpit than he did in a church. However, his love for the sky would ultimately lead him to a watery grave in the Pacific Ocean, piloting a machine that was less a standard airplane and more a fiberglass rocket with a fatal design flaw. This is the devastating account of a crash caused not by a storm or a drunk pilot, but by a single, impossible-to-reach handle and a split-second physical struggle. proving that even the most experienced aviators are at the mercy of bad engineering. We are investigating the 10 most heartbreaking air disasters that silenced the music industry forever. This case is particularly haunting because of the cruel irony of his most famous song, Leaving on a Jet Plane, a title that became a grim epitaph for a man who flew away and never came back. To understand the crash, you have to understand the plane. It wasn't a Cessna or a Beechcraft. It was a Rutan Long EZ, an experimental home-built aircraft that looked like something out of Star Wars. It was sleek, fast, and designed for enthusiasts. John Denver had just purchased one. He was excited. On the afternoon of October 12, 1997, he took the plane up for a series of practice flights, performing touch-and-go landings at the Monterey Peninsula Airport. The weather was perfect, the sky a brilliant blue. But the specific plane John bought had a hidden danger. The builder of the aircraft had deviated from the standard design. In a standard Long EZ, the fuel selector valve, the handle you turn to switch tanks, is located between the pilot's legs, easy to reach. But in John's plane, the builder had placed the handle behind the pilot's left shoulder. To switch tanks, the pilot had to take his hand off the controls, unbuckle his shoulder harness, turn his body completely around, and blindly crank a stiff handle. It was an ergonomic nightmare, a trap waiting to be sprung. John took off with low fuel. He knew it, but he thought he had enough for a short flight. He was flying over the Pacific Grove shoreline, about 500 feet above the water, enjoying the view. But then the engine sputtered. The fuel tank he was using ran dry. It was a routine problem with a routine solution. Switch the tank. But in this plane, that simple act was a physical impossibility. Investigators believe that John, realizing his engine was dying, reached over his left shoulder to turn the valve. He had to torque his body. As he twisted, his right foot likely pushed down on the rudder pedal, the control that steers the nose of the plane. He was fighting the valve and unknowingly steering the plane into a dive. The aircraft banked sharply to the right and pitched down. It didn't glide, it plunged. Witnesses on the shore, enjoying a Sunday afternoon at the beach, heard a pop and then saw the plane dive straight into the ocean. It hit the water with tremendous force, shattering instantly. The crash was violent and absolute. There was no fireball, just a debris field of fiberglass and foam floating on the surface of the bay. The impact was so severe that John Denver's body was dismembered. When the Coast Guard recovered his remains, they could not identify him by his face. They had to use his fingerprints, which were on file from his drunk driving arrests years earlier. The country boy was gone, swallowed by the Pacific. He was 53 years old. The National Transportation Board, NTSB, investigation was scathing. They pinpointed the fuel selector valve placement as the primary cause of the accident, combined with John's decision to take off with low fuel without refueling first. It was a tragedy of mechanics and human error. This case brings up a serious debate about experimental aviation. John Denver was flying a plane built by an amateur in a garage, essentially. Do you think celebrities and wealthy hobbyists take too many risks with experimental vehicles? Or was this just a freak accident that could have happened to anyone? I want to hear your thoughts on the risks of aviation in the comments below. John Denver's death silenced the voice of the Rockies. He was a man who advocated for the environment, for space exploration, and for peace, only to die in a violent mechanical struggle against his own machine. He proved that you can write the songs that the whole world sings, but you cannot rewrite the laws of physics when you are 500 feet above the water with a dry fuel tank. He left on a jet plane, or rather, a fiberglass one, and he didn't know when he would be back again. He never was. If this tragic story of the folk hero who fell from the sky left you stunned, please hit the like button. Share this video with every acoustic music fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed for Part 10, the final and most nostalgic chapter, where we will investigate the New Year's Eve crash that killed the original teen idol. Number 10. Ricky Nelson. We end our journey with a tragedy that struck at the very heart of American nostalgia, killing the man who was the living bridge between the golden age of television and the birth of rock and roll. This is the story of Eric Hilliard Nelson, known to the world as Ricky Nelson. Before Justin Bieber, before the Beatles, there was Ricky. He grew up on TV, literally, starring alongside his real-life family in the adventures of Ozzy and Harriet. He was the original teen idol, the first artist to use television to launch a music career, singing hits like Poor Little Fool and Hello Mary Lou to millions of swooning teenagers every week. He was handsome, he was talented, and he was the face of 1950s innocence. But by 1985, Ricky Nelson was 45 years old. He was divorced, tired, and trying to stage a comeback, touring the oldies circuit to pay the bills. He was still a star, but the shine was fading. On New Year's Eve, 1985, he was heading to a concert in Dallas, Texas, hoping to ring in 1986 with a celebration of his legacy. Instead, his journey ended in a cow pasture in DeKalb, Texas, in a crash that was initially blamed on a freebasing drug rumor, but was actually caused by a mechanical failure that turned his luxury plane into a flying furnace. We have investigated 10 heartbreaking air disasters. We end here because Ricky Nelson's death felt like the final nail in the coffin of the 50s dream, a fiery end to a life that had been lived entirely in the public eye. The flight began in Guntersville, Alabama. Ricky, his fiancée Helen Blair, and his backing band, the Stone Canyon Band, boarded his private DC-3 aircraft. The plane was a legend in itself, a workhorse of World War II that had once belonged to Jerry Lee Lewis. It was a flying piece of history, but it was also old and prone to issues. The pilot was Brad Rank, a man whose actions that day would become the subject of intense scrutiny. As the plane cruised over Texas, smoke began to fill the cabin. It wasn't a slow leak, it was a sudden, choking cloud. The pilot realized too late that the heater in the back of the plane, a gasoline-powered heater, had malfunctioned. It wasn't just smoking, it was on fire. The flames spread rapidly through the cabin, fed by the oxygen and the old materials of the plane. The passengers were trapped in a metal tube that was burning from the inside out. The pilot frantically tried to find a place to land, aiming for a field near DeKalb, Texas. But the smoke was blinding, and the heat was unbearable. The crash landing was violent. The DC-3 hit a line of trees, shearing off wings and slamming into the ground. But the impact didn't kill everyone immediately. The fire did. The pilot and co-pilot managed to escape through the cockpit windows, suffering severe burns but surviving. But Ricky Nelson, his fiancée, and his entire band were trapped in the fuselage. They were consumed by the flames. When the firefighters arrived, there was nothing left but a charred skeleton of a plane. Ricky Nelson was gone. The rumors started immediately. The press, hungry for a scandal, reported that the fire was caused by Ricky and his entourage freebasing cocaine in the back of the plane, igniting the ether. It was a salacious, destructive lie that tarnished his legacy for years. The NTSB investigation, however, cleared his name. They found no evidence of drug paraphernalia or drug use as the cause. The cause was a faulty heater, a mechanical failure that turned a routine flight into a death trap. The drug rumor was a final insult to a man who had just lost his life. This case is a painful reminder of how quickly a legacy can be rewritten by a false headline. Do you remember the freebasing rumor? Does the truth about the heater change how you view the tragedy, or does the scandal still overshadow the facts? I want to hear your thoughts on the media's treatment of Ricky Nelson in the comments below. Ricky Nelson's death was the end of an era. He was the boy America raised, the first reality star, and a true rock pioneer. His twin sons, Matthew and Gunnar, would go on to form the band Nelson and top the charts, carrying on the family legacy, but the father who started it all was lost in a field in Texas, silenced by a fire he didn't start. He proved that you can grow up on TV, you can be the idol of a nation, but in the end, gravity and fire respect no one. This concludes our deep dive into the 10 music legends wiped out by plane crashes. We have traveled from the cornfields of Iowa to the swamps of Mississippi, seeing that the sky has claimed more talent than any drug or rival. If this series opened your eyes to the fragile history of music, please hit the like button, share this video with every music fan you know, and make sure you are subscribed and have the bell turned on. We have a massive new investigation starting next week that digs into the dark secrets of Hollywood's biggest child stars.